Hi, welcome to another edition of Antique Radio Archaeology. Today we're going to begin part 2 of the multi-part series on the Chelsea Super 5 radio line. In this particular episode, we are going to be doing a restoration on the version 2 of the 1925 Super 5, which has the Bakelite front panel. So here's the later version. This one does have the catch. It does have the right number of terminals on the back. It has the wrong type of terminals on the antenna here. I'm going to have to get the correct ones, but those are good. This case actually is in really good shape, so that'll be the least of my worries on this one. This might just need a little bit of a restore finish to get this one up to speed. Now, one of my issues here, like I said, this one has the block that holds this up. And as you can see, I have the different tube sockets in this one. The transformers go on the bottom. They are missing on this one. Go ahead and pull this out if I can. Alright, so there is definitely the wrong capacitor here. The coils look to be in good shape, so I don't have to worry too much about that. Those are those blocks I was referring to. As you can see, that's very similar to the metal chassis version. But anyway, I'm just going to leave this because we're going to start disassembly. Okay. One of the things that I've discovered, as you can see here, there is some rodent damage. So I didn't want to do this, but I think I'm going to have to. I'm going to go ahead and pull this all apart so I can clean this plate up. Because I can't, you can actually smell that. It's not very strong, so it's probably been there for years, but I just need to do something about it. So as I'm doing this cleanup work, I happen to notice, okay, I thought these were all just basically worn down to brass. But what I discovered was this particular radio is full of lacquer. And this is covered in lacquer. As you can see, it's like night and day. The other thing I'm having problems with is the tube sockets, which are covered in lacquer. Alright, so here's all the parts for the later version of the 1925 Super 5. They're all cleaned up. The biggest issue I had was lacquer. Somebody had coated this faceplate with lacquer, they had coated the dials with lacquer, these knobs with lacquer. They also sprayed lacquer in the cabinet, covered all the tube sockets with lacquer, and just cleaning all that lacquer off was probably the most tedious part of this entire operation. But got everything pretty much cleaned up, ready to go. Now it's just a matter of getting it assembled. So today we're going to start reassembly of the chassis plate, which is this right here. And it's a little bit more complex than the earlier version, because on the early version all these components were on top of the plate. Well, in this later version, what's happening is you've got connections on the top of the plate and you've got connections underneath. Now underneath a lot more is happening because we put the transformers down underneath, we moved them from the top to the bottom, and the other thing is we took the coils off the back of the condensers and they're going on that plate as well. And it's all going to be underneath because you're going to have the little blocks of wood holding it up. So it's a little bit more complex on this particular part of the assembly, but when it's all done it looks a lot simpler because you're not seeing all the hidden components. Now, like always, I also did a schematic diagram showing the changes. There's not really a lot of changes, the main ones being the way the rheostats are hooked up, because the way it was on the other one, the rheostats went to ground. This one, they're not quite doing that. So we'll get into that later when I talk about how it operates. But for now, let's go ahead and start orienting everything. So the first step is going to be orienting these tube sockets and getting them into the board. One of the things that I want to do is I want the grids all facing that direction, mainly because that's where the plate's going to go, and so I've got the board oriented for that to happen. Now the other thing is these first two tube sockets have grid tabs on them, because these are some of those top connections. You got your grid lead going here, and these two are going to go to the tuning condensers. So they need to be in the first three spots here, and then you got those two there. So we're going to go ahead and pop those in for now, without hopefully destroying the board too much. If you notice, some of these tabs are bent in, some of them are bent out. The ones that are bent in are the grids and plates. The ones that are bent out are the tabs for the filaments. New bus wire. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm taking some big screws here, just shoving them in here. These are just to shove the little terminals forward so I can get the bus wire on it. Okay, that's her. Okay, so I knocked out my bus wires for the filaments, which are going to be these two right here, B1 and B2, B1 and B2, B3, 4, and 5, that's this bus bar right here, 3, 4, and 5, And then of course we got the one that hits all the filaments, which is that bar running all the way down there. It's right here. And as you can see, we have that capacitor C1 coming off of it. Okay. Alright, so I got all the connections here. I just made these two plate connections here from the coils. Grid connections I did earlier. Of course the filaments are all filaments. I did attach a wire to this plate here that goes up to here. This wire here comes up and it's actually supposed to go to this plate, but I went ahead and connected it here instead. So either way it's the same connection. The transformer's all been wired in. I've got my grid to grid, my filament over to both these filaments tied to that filament there. I've got my plate coming over hitting C1 and then back over here and hitting that plate. That's pretty much all the connections here. The rest of these I'm going to have to hook up. I can hook up later, but this thing's pretty much wired at this point. Now, the only thing I'm going to do yet is I need to put some glue on these coils because they're kind of coming apart there. So okay, so first order of business is I need to assemble this obviously, but the capacitor here, the way it comes off of that bar going between VR2 and VC3 isn't going to happen here because I have the little flat rheostats instead of the rounded ones. So obviously there was a capacitor here at one time that's been replaced with one of these wax capacitors. I did find one that I can go ahead and solder on there, so I'm going to go ahead and do that first and then go from there. Alright, so everything's hooked to the chassis. I've got all these terminal bars, bus bars hooked up. So what I'm going to do now, I need to get these kind of out of the way. I need to start hooking up this chassis. So, in order to attach the chassis to the cabinet, I need 4 of these. I only have 2, so I'm going to go ahead and fabricate some out of threaded rod, and I'm going to go ahead and make 4 of them. Okay, so I got my 4 threaded rods, which match the originals. I'll set those aside because I'm going to use these, and these go for the faceplate. Okay. So there are some slight differences between the early version and the later version of the Chelsea Model 125 Super 5. The later version, off the plate of VR3 you have C1. It comes here and it hits actually A plus B minus. Whereas on the early version, C1 hits the ground, A minus ground. So that's one difference. Another is on the filaments. On the filaments of the later version, both rheostats are tied to ground, and the wipers go through the filaments back to the A plus B minus bus. You got that here and you got that here on all these. So wipers on both of those go to A minus B plus. On the early version, the wipers are tied to ground on the RF section, whereas the rheostat's tied to the A plus B minus. But on VR2, the wiper side is tied to the A plus B minus, and the rheostat itself is tied to ground. So those are the 2 minor changes between the early and later version, that capacitor C1 and the way the rheostats are wired. But basically they operate the same way. You have your RF comes in, hits L1, then the grid, you tune it, comes over, hits L2, comes to the grid, tune it further, and comes here, hits L3, that tank circuit there, and then you come across the grid leak into V3, which is then your audio is developed, your C1 gets rid of your RF, and you have your 2 stages of amplification. Off V4, you go to the phone jack. Off of V5, you hit the loudspeaker jack. And that's where your B plus 90 is tied. Your 45 comes up through and hits that V3 plate. And of course you have your A plus hitting the filaments. Okay, all the tubes are lit up.
which brings us to that new one by Johnny Mercer. A good song, and we'll buy it for Steve Taylor and Oliver Reeves. Here goes the nickel, and it's Johnny Mercer singing I'm Gonna See My Baby.
So this concludes yet another edition of Antique Radio Archaeology. Now this was the 1925 Super 5 later version. There is one other later version that I have, and that's the wood-faced model. Now I'm not going to do that during this series, mainly because electrically it's the same as this radio. Just the faceplate is different, so I'm going to reserve that for a video later down the line. So the next video in the series will be on the 1926 Chelsea Super 5, and I've already gotten started on that. So happy restorations, everybody. Hope to see you again next video. Goodbye.